Welcome to Finance in 5. This sector is so huge that there's no way we could possibly cover more than a handful of the market's biggest players. But having sifted through a lot of them, I've settled on a few that might be worth paying attention to because of the untapped market they have the potential to reach. And the reason for the picture of Warren Buffett on the thumbnail for this video is that, as some of you may be aware of, Warren Buffett has recently purchased shares in a number of leading biotech companies. So we'll go over those and one or two other key nuggets of useful information that'll help you with your investing journey. You're not going to want to miss it. Coming up today on Finance in 5. Welcome to the show, dear friend. So, when somebody tells you that Warren Buffett recently declared a major interest in Pfizer, you probably find yourself thinking, well, of course, a man in his 91st year needs all the Viagra he can get his hands on. Perhaps, but what we're actually talking about today, friend, is not the expiry of Pfizer's Viagra patent, as tasteful as that thought of yours was.
Donald J. Trump is now President of the United States. President Obama is the ex-president. And Mr. Trump, for the moment.
Instead, we're focusing on the recent 13F SEC filing lodged by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, which reveals his brand new investments in biotech companies, including Pfizer. In actual fact, a quick glance at this filing shows us that Pfizer isn't in fact that significant among the four big pharmaceutical companies he has bought shares in recently, at least not in relative terms. Buffett has taken out shares in Merck, Bristol Myers Squibb, Abbvie and Pfizer, with Pfizer actually being the smallest position of these four companies. He has $136.2 million worth of stock in Pfizer. However, he has around 15 times that sum invested in dollar terms in the other three, with each of Bristol Myers, Abbvie and Merck & Co. receiving over $1.8 billion of Berkshire Hathaway's investment capital. So, of all of the sectors to get involved in, why biotech? Well, there are a few clues. First, the growing demand globally for a safe and effective coronavirus vaccine is already beginning to swell the coffers of companies racing to supply it. Pfizer's pledge to dispatch 100 million doses to all corners of the UK will ensure that their cash flow stacks up higher than the countless mobile refrigeration units they continue to stockpile with this medicine. And of course, you don't have to take it. You just won't be allowed into sports or music venues, bars, shops, businesses, campuses, workplaces, or onboard passenger jets without proof that you've had it. Of course, I don't have any proof of that, it's all anecdotal, but we'll see what happens. If you start to question its rollout or think for yourself, then there could be real problems. It's important to stop and trust what Big Tech, Fauci, and Matthew Hancock say. There's comfort in knowing that the government can be relied upon to do all of your thinking for you. They take responsibility each and every week for managing more and more aspects of life that many of us never invited them into in the first place. But who knows, maybe there's no need to be negative. Perhaps the upside will arrive one day soon when I wake up fully clothed or something. Or maybe someone's washed my car or something of that sort. Anyway, back to topic. This video is not about governments, even though they are the biggest buyers of many of these companies' vaccines. So the first company we're going to look at is what Warren Buffett would call a big fat pitch, and that is Bristol Myers Squibb. So he gives a little bit of a description here of what that is, a big fat pitch. It's apparently, according to an analyst here, going to achieve its 2024 goal by the end of 2022. It recently spent $13.1 billion to acquire MyoKardia, and that's a smaller company that developed drugs for people living with cardiovascular conditions, which is a huge market globally. It is the free cash flow of Bristol Myers Squibb that is going to fund dividends and buybacks, and has been doing, and also repays debt. And thanks to Bristol Myers converting 28% of every dollar in sales into free cash flow, the rating agencies consider its deleveraging plan to be highly credible, including a 2021 consensus free cash flow payout ratio of 26.7% and 2021 consensus free cash flow margin of 20%. Analysts think it's going to retain 21 cents of every dollar in sales next year as post-dividend free cash flow that then is going to be used for paying debt down, buying back its undervalued stock, or buying other biotech companies, which will improve its product portfolio even more. Looking at the longer term view, it could grow its sales over 100% between 2020 and 2024. That's because it's packed to the rafters with blockbuster specialty drugs, just 7 of which should generate $1 billion or more in sales. In 2022, analysts expect Bristol Myers' drugs to be selling a total of 50 different numbers, with 7 generating $1 billion or more in sales. It's also got more than 50 new drugs in development to treat more than 40 conditions, mostly focused on highly lucrative cancer, immunology, and cardiovascular issues. Bristol Myers Squibb is a research and development powerhouse with strong execution on drug launches and efficient R&D spending, which over the last year was 24% of sales. So as we look at this chart, we see that the current valuation for Bristol Myers Squibb shares is around $60. Perhaps it's gone up a tiny bit just over the last day or so. And this is by no means a historical high or a historical low. It's sort of about mid-range. It really has gone up quite a bit since the low in March, but it's been much higher historically. According to this chart, BMQ has outperformed the S&P, and this is quite interesting. Pharma stocks have outperformed the S&P 500 by about 8% over the course of the last few years. So the generalized consensus estimate is that that trend is set to continue over the course of the upcoming 2, 3, 5 years, or perhaps even more. In this chart, we see that analysts have been reasonably accurate when it comes to predicting the share price of this company over time, and it shows a margin of error here. So ideally, the share price should go right up. So let's just look again briefly at the current price just to refresh ourselves. About $60 or so. This is with a dividend payout ratio of around 2.6%. So that's fairly respectable. But then when we look at this table, because we know that Warren Buffett is a value investor, the table tells us or shows us that fair value for this company is actually in 2020 around about $90, and then that's set to go up to $111 by 2023. The fact that it hasn't arrived there yet just presents the buying opportunity. This is the whole philosophy behind value investing. And for Warren, it doesn't really matter where his cash is nestling as long as it's netting him some returns. So 111, that's the target share price for 2023, divided by the current share price. We get this factor of 1.83, which we multiply by 1.8 million, which he's got currently invested. We see that that will produce 3.29, nearly 3.3 billion. So on the upside, if the investment plays out in the way that many analysts are predicting that it might, he's going to have 3.3 billion in a couple of years' time. Also, if we try to work out how much he's going to be netting for himself in dividend payouts during the time that he's got this money invested in Bristol Myers, we can work out fairly quickly it's about $40 million. Better than a kick in the face. $46.8 million probably. Have I got the maths right there? Hopefully I have. I'm going to race through the next ones because otherwise this video will go on forever. The next company is Abbvie. So it had revenues last year of over nearly $13 billion. It makes products for immunology, hematic oncology, and rheumatoid arthritis, as well as things like BIOTECH, and it's growing year on year. If you look here at this chart, it shows that the share price right now is just over $105 per share. But then we look at the revisions for next year, earnings per share estimates are set to increase, and there's going to be an increase in the dividend payout to over 20% in the first quarter of next year. It will go up over 10% in the first quarter of next year. Next, Merck. This is a huge pharmaceutical company, which apparently, according to this article, is surprisingly underfollowed. However, it produces a drug which is the most promising drug in the world called Keytruda, according to this analyst. Keytruda, which goes by its given name pembrolizumab, is a monoclonal antibody which is used to treat a range of tumors, including lung cancers, melanoma, and colorectal cancers. Oncology is one of the biggest segments of the biotech industry, with forecasted revenues of $180 billion in 2025. So the addressable market is enormous. Because of the fact that this particular monoclonal antibody, Keytruda, which is produced and only produced by Merck, can be used to treat a range of conditions, its revenue generation potential isn't limited to just one subsegment of the market. In the most recent quarter, it generated $3.7 billion of sales, which is $15 billion annualized. When we factor in the fact that this last quarter was impacted by the pandemic, which has meant that fewer people will have accessed healthcare settings in order to actually receive cancer treatments, we can assume that this particular medication would have been used in even higher quantities had unfettered access to healthcare been available to everybody. which means that the upside potential for it is almost unbelievable, especially when you consider the fact that more and more people are getting cancers as we go forward in time. The dividend as well that this company pays is also respectable. If Merck keeps on increasing its dividend per year, then long-term holders will see their income grow meaningfully as the years go by. So next, Pfizer. Pfizer is the smallest biotech position of Buffett's, and we know that they're shipping out fewer vaccines during December due to supply chain constraints. This model in an article that I read shows that the growth projections aren't as high for Pfizer as they are for other companies. And competitor vaccine suppliers such as Moderna and CureVac, which Bill Gates loves to talk about, are supplying vaccines which contain mRNA and also contain fibroblasts derived from aborted 14-week-old fetuses. What could possibly go wrong? There are many more biotech companies we could talk about, and there is one that I made quite a bit of money on a few years ago called Sangamo Biosciences. This is a small biotech company based in California which has spent the last few decades developing gene editing technology aimed at tackling various conditions. Using its proprietary zinc finger nucleases, it aims to correct DNA sequences in which a mutated or absent gene sequence of a patient is the single reason for a specific condition or pathology. And there are a number of examples of this. In the case of cystic fibrosis, it's a cell membrane ion transporter which doesn't work properly, causing blockages and mucus to develop. In haemophilia A, factor VIII protein isn't produced because of the absence of its coding region, which leads to bleeding. It happens in 1 in 2,000 live births of males and was common in the Russian royal family at the turn of the last century. There are many others which you've probably already been aware of from school. The theory is that correcting those sequences at the stem cell level can reduce or ameliorate the condition in question. Some of the research Sangamo does involves what is known as an ex vivo approach, which means removing cells from patients, editing the genomes of those cells and introducing them back into the patient's body to bring about a positive clinical change. Several years ago, there were reports of the world's first patient having been cured of AIDS. Called the Berlin patient, Timothy Brown was diagnosed with HIV in 1995. He'd been taking antiretroviral combination therapy for several years, but developed a form of blood cancer in 2006, which meant he needed radiotherapy followed by a bone marrow transfusion. Interestingly, Timothy Brown's doctor found out that one of those bone marrow donors had what was known as a CCR5 mutation. Not only would his cancer be cured, but so too would his HIV. So this approach was followed. They administered radiotherapy to wipe out Brown's entire immune system, then administered the donor bone marrow, and the outcome was as expected. This meant that, technically speaking, this patient did have HIV in his body, but effectively it was inert because it had no susceptible host cells to infect. Red blood cells, of course, have no nucleus, so as soon as the T lymphocytes can be made impervious to destruction, the virus can't cause any lasting damage to the host. So I mention all of that because a few years ago, Sangamo aimed to replicate this effect by editing T lymphocytes and stem cells ex vivo from HIV-infected patients and then reintroducing them back into the patient's bodies. The holy grail of this approach was to edit the CCR5 proteins expressed by the stem cells because the stem cells can differentiate and give rise to the T lymphocytes as well as to other cell lineages. Continuous replication of these edited stem cells would give rise to a compartment of the immune system which remained impervious to HIV infection, enabling the functional cure to be extended to this patient cohort who would no longer require daily administration of antiretroviral medications. The results of these trials were promising. However, there were some limitations to the efficiency of the gene editing technology, which meant that the trial was discontinued. However, proof of concept was demonstrated as many of the volunteers were able to discontinue their medication for several months, and one for over a year. There used to be a biotech company called Shire which funded a number of these clinical trials. For a few years, Sangamo was receiving milestone payments from Shire, and is doing so now from Pfizer with its haemophilia cure. Receiving research grants from more established companies allows biotech startups to fund clinical trials as well as to carry out further research. This is how many small biotech firms get a product over the finish line. A lot of them fail, but the ones that succeed frequently are bought out by the Gileads, the Pfizers, and the AstraZenecas of the world. Shire itself was bought out by a Japanese company, and the value of my shares went up quite a lot. This was completely accidental and by an absolute fluke. It just so happened that I was reading a lot of this research about the work that they were doing, and hey presto, bought some shares very cheaply, and then they went up. It wasn't because I am skillful in any way, I was just lucky at that particular time, but I just thought I would mention this company because that was my experience, and the work that they're doing is interesting, and it still goes on to this day. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you like this kind of content, by all means, don't forget to click like, subscribe, and write a comment down below. And hopefully, we'll see you for the next video. All the very best. Take care.